Good afternoon to some, good evening to the rest. Those in the future, keep us in suspense. I don't want to know what the future holds yet. So here we are. It's February and the year is already ticking along. I'm excited for this one, as Jeff mentioned, just because it's two things. Number one, it's a deviation from some of the things that we have been doing, which have been more body system condition specific webinars, which we will get back to, but we got to throw in a few of our greatest hits every so often. And the story of master supplements really did start with digestive wellness and probiotics specifically. And at its infancy, when this company was formed, the gut health craze was not at all what it was, but being cutting edge and leading the way, sometimes it takes some time for things to catch on in terms of people's awareness catching up with what it is a product or a series of products can do, and how being ahead of time in some cases is opportune when an industry catches up. So today we're going to answer the following question. Why Bifidobacteria? Well, obviously the answer is because, but I hope to give you a little bit more context with what are my favorite microbes. And I only say that probably because today's webinar made me really dive into them deeply, pun intended. So without further ado, I think to know where we're going, we have to know where we've been. And that's not quite a perfect context, but you'll understand what I mean when I get into the meat of this. We need to know the story of how Bifidobacteria interrelate with the human body. We need to understand the dynamic connection points of how microbes colonize us, the host, and how they are meant to create an environment that is both symbiotic for them to live in and symbiotic for us to house them. So if we want to help someone with their gut health, we need to understand the story of how we actually are inoculated with Bifidobacterium and what the natural dance between host and microbe looks like, so that we can push someone back to a pattern of homeostasis or symbiosis, which is the actual opposite of allostasis and dysbiosis. And this is a contested thing. What I mean by contested is most people are taught, especially those in medical school, the babies are born sterile. Some research says that's true. Newer research is showing that there are microbes that can colonize the placenta. I mean, theoretically speaking, if someone has leaky gut as a mother, there could be microbes that are translocating into their bloodstream and circulating into the baby via the placenta. That being said, the bulk of colonization, the thing that really gets the human microbe interaction started, is the birthing process itself. So what is understood is most babies get their first big dose of microbes at birth, and nature designed this to be done through passing through the birth canal. And that is the seeding concept. The initial seeding is done via the delivery. However, if we go against nature for whatever reason, we change the initial interaction between microbe and human, which I'm sure a lot of you know. These microbes are then supported naturally by what nature makes in the form of the perfect food for a human, a baby. And these microbes then grow and multiply, and they start to take on their individual shape. And in doing so, they start to create these axes, the gut immune axis, the gut brain axis, what have you. So we are 50 billion cells, which approximately houses 50 billion plus microbes. So even though we are human, we are far more complex than simply human genetics. And it is the initiation of how we come into the world from a biochemical perspective that shapes our likely relationship with the concept of health or the affinity for the predisposition to various diseases. Vaginal delivery is super important for a few reasons. Number one, the health of the mother and the vaginal delivery constitutes the initial seeding of the microbes that the baby gets. So the maternal, vaginal, and fecal bacteria, the gut health of the mom, has some of the most powerful initial impacts. And it's set up in a very, very intricate and elegant way. The first colonizers are actually facultative anaerobes. So they can kind of switch, so to speak. And what they do is they, being a little bit more hardy and able to survive in areas where others can't, they prime the system for what we really want as our first inoculation, the strict anaerobes. So we get seeded with specific bacteria that have a hardier ability to survive, and they start to create a more acidic environment that is a lower pH deprived of oxygen. So the real big players that influence, and I should say positively influence, the immune system can actually take hold. And during the first few months and first few years of life, there is a rapid and dynamic change of how the microbiome is shaped to the point where as the baby starts to continuously feed on breast milk or whatever foods are introduced based upon stages of life, by the age of about 3 to 5 years old, some say 2 to 5 years old, that individual develops what's called an adult-like phenotype of their microbiome. And over the course of their life, the profile is set, but based upon the experiences that person has in their lives, the diet they consume, the water they drink, the lifestyle they lead, what have you, it is an influence on either pushing the microbiome into a positive or a negative direction. And because we're a digestive wellness company and we know how many people are using our products, right now on the planet, I think there's too many people who have moved in a negative direction trying to get back to their ideal state. Times are also changing. You know, historically speaking, the overwhelming concentrations of early microbes that are true colonizers are Bifidobacteria. And it's for good reason that I'll get into. And based upon how I said the birthing process goes, but in addition to the birthing process, the postnatal feeding process and how foods are introduced and in what order, it can have a positive or a negative impact in the development cycle of that. So it is possible that an unfortunate series of events can create an early life dysbiosis, which you probably would see if you've ever seen a colicky child. And very few people would connect the concept of infancy colic to potentially an autoimmune disease down the line. But if that child has entered the world improperly and it has not been nurtured from a nourishment perspective, then the profile of the microbes takes on too much diversity too early. And as a result of that, the immune system never gets properly educated. So this graphic pretty much tells us everything. And I've tried to find some really good graphics for this lecture, and I'll definitely send out the slides. But knowing this process, knowing how nature intended it, I think there's wisdom in there when it comes to replicating certain aspects of food selection and probiotic and prebiotic supplementation in order to try to foster an optimal environment within the gut. So if we do a brief summary of what we talked about so far, the initial colonization is from an optimal birthing process. What that does is it sets the tone by having the right kinds of microbes, specifically from the Enterobacter species, be the first colonizers that then prime the optimal profile of early colonizers. As a result of an ideal way of growing up and being fed the proper foods, specifically human milk, which has specialized immune educating cells like immunoglobulins, but it also has something called an HMO, which is also a name from an American medical service, if I'm properly informed. But HMO here stands for human milk oligosaccharides, and they are primed to be the perfect food for Bifidobacteria and other strains. And as a result of that, in addition to the health of the mother and the lifestyle the mother lives, this is how we set the tone for the optimal gut health of a child, and then life takes over. So it is really cool how all of these processes come together in a very elegant way. The human milk oligosaccharides are essentially undigestible milk fibers. They're sugars inside the milk that we can't actually enzymatically break down and derive nutrition from, but they are prime food specifically for Bifidobacterium infantis. And for those who have a background in Latin, if you hear the word infantis and you think, wow, that sounds a lot like infant, it's probably some logic and connection to that. And how this works is really, really amazing. So we want to ensure that the pH of the digestive system is always optimal to create the ideal terrain. In medicine, a lot of people think the germ is the problem, and then they've heard the concept of the terrain, but they really don't understand what the terrain means. Certain parts of the gut are oxygen rich. Certain parts of the gut are oxygen deprived. When we have something called a strict anaerobe, that can only survive in an oxygen deprived environment. And a way to keep an oxygen deprived environment optimized is through the use of acidity, lowering the pH via the production of short chain fatty acids. So this happens in a baby's gut. When the mom's milk oligosaccharides are transferred to the baby, they are the perfect food programmed to essentially cross-react positively with Bifidobacteria, who then produce high amounts of acetate and lactate, which are short-chain fatty acids that keep the pH in the colon low enough to prevent the colonization by pathogenic species like E. coli, but they also help to set the tone for then the rapid expansion and diversity of the different profile and species of microbes that become the microbiome, of which Bifidobacteria are an important underpinning. So the process really becomes an important thing to consider. In utero, if a mother's given high doses of antibiotics or if she's on a standard American diet, well, that's already going to prime things for a more negative consequence, because the initial inoculation of what the baby's going to experience are probably more dysbiotic or potentially pathogenic bacteria. And then there's the duration of how long the baby's in gestation, and the mode of delivery in the hospital setting, and does the baby have time to have skin contact with the mom? And then the infancy is really what sets the tone, because it's the early life influences that ultimately negatively or positively impact. And we know from multitudes of different research that adults born via cesarean have a fecal microbiome and a gut microbiome that is more akin to that of the skin of whoever first touches them. And if they never have the ability to be swabbed with vaginal secretions upon being born, or they don't get skin contact time with mom and they get early sterilization, then that person's gut immune system has taken a massive hit. And I don't know if people ask these questions, but it's probably a worthwhile thing to include in your intake process for someone who is asthmatic, does have an autoimmune condition, or high amounts of allergies and sensitivities. Ask them how they were born and ask them how long they were breastfed for. I've asked that question to most clients, and there definitely is a correlation between those who were optimally delivered are healthier later in life, and those who were suboptimally delivered, unfortunately, have a little less adaptability to when their health goes compromised. It's a very confusing world in the sense that there's a lot of variables, and sometimes we get stuck in the details. But this graphic, in my opinion, that comes from a study that we can look at just after this, shows you the path. So early life exposures are the things that ultimately influence the gut microbiota. The ability to create a symbiosis, and symbiosis is like I described, the internal environment of the microbiome and the species of bacteria that inhabit it are optimized for them to live healthily and happily, and therefore they help to contribute to our health and improving it via a crosstalk style of communication. A dysbiosis is when that early life exposure unfortunately didn't go in an optimal way, and as a result of the compromised early exposure, the dysbiosis creates a lot of predispositions for intestinal issues and diseases, and ultimately down the road, people who are born this way more likely develop cardiac issues, metabolic issues, type 2 diabetes, things of that nature. Because if you look at studies of young children, and this is actually pulled from the study on the previous slide, what they did here is they looked at 24 healthy babies, and they separated them into 4 different categories. So you have breastfed, vaginally born, breastfed, cesarean born, formula fed, vaginally born, formula fed, cesarean born. No surprise, the vaginal born breastfed children had the most optimal profile of initial bacteria, specifically the highest quantities of Bifidobacteria, and the cesarean babies, who were mostly formula fed, had the lowest quantity of Bifido, but the potentially highest quantity of pathogens and a less than optimal diversity for an infant to have. So these things are really important for taking stock in terms of understanding the patterns that initially took hold in someone's early life, and maybe extrapolating out to the here and now as to why they may have developed a certain disease, condition, an aspect of their life that is compromised, that's probably brought them into your office and brought you into their worlds. So if you look at the early patterns of life and disruption, I believe that it's a baseline of influence for what happens in adulthood. I've mentioned it before, and I think when it comes to health, energy is everything, and how a system maintains its highest state of energy is by being optimally laid out and working very efficiently. It does the most work with the least amount of effort. If someone has an issue where they're already immune compromised at a young age, then there's a lot of extra energy that is going to that immune system to try to find resolution in its problems. And when someone is compromised as they go through life, typically speaking, unless they do something about it, their early life digestive issues, based upon what we know about how the gut immune system and leaky gut can develop from dysbiosis, is more strongly than ever connecting to all things, not only just autoimmunity, but through the gut lung axis, respiratory issues, and long COVID, through the gut, brain axis, neurodegenerative issues, and dementia. So I think these things are important factors to take in and also to consider when trying to replicate what Mother Nature wanted in the first place in the form of a supplemental intervention to help that person find homeostasis and health again. Because there is a defined process, and this is, I think, how nature does it. You have your baseline inoculation. That's the vaginal birth process or the initial exposure to microbes. Then you have the stimulation of growth through optimal food selection and hopefully long breastfeeding. And then you have that evolution and diversification based upon the experiences and the stresses that children expose themselves to. If they go play outside in the garden, if they have a pet, if they're not overly sanitized with things like hand sanitizer, it's shown that that child develops a more diverse microbiome and ultimately an immune system that has the ability to modulate itself much better. And I want you to remember this because this is going to come back later on. So I truly do believe that, we can lose ourselves in the details of how many microbes of a certain strain of bacteria someone needs, but you may be chasing a ghost after a while, because if we're not seeing the forest through the trees, we have to understand that the pattern is of the utmost importance when we have to understand how to modulate someone's issues and the symptoms that they're saying. If we go against the patterns of nature, oftentimes I don't think we come out with a positive outcome. And this is why I think that statement is really important and impactful. There is no perfect gut microbiome. Each person technically has their own unique profile based upon the baseline microbes that they got from their mom and their environment. And that goes through who knows how many permutations based upon physiologic experiences. What I mean by that is, if you have someone who had 10 courses of antibiotics before the age of 12, that's really changed their microbiome in a way where someone who hasn't had any antibiotics and has reached the age of 12 has. So you can never truly compare that to someone's baseline before any kind of issues manifested, because we don't yet have time machines and we don't have good enough data to understand what they need, nor can we have the technology to design a probiotic yet. Maybe in the future, I'm hopeful. But this last statement is something that I kind of want to really hit home before we shift gears. Unless we understand the patterns of nature and how symbiosis is intended, which we very in-depthly discussed in understanding the birthing process, we have to understand the infant developmental process that will potentially create a healthy adult and the infant developmental process that will potentially create a compromised or a sick adult. How do these scenarios present themselves via symptoms? What are the different things that a child would experience when they have gut issues, and how would that manifest over the course of 2 or 3 decades if those issues were never rectified? And if we can analyze the symptoms, what labs can we run to give us a good picture? If we run a stool test, are we looking only at the page that shows the different species of bacteria that were in the stool that day? Because if you run another stool test the next day, you're going to get different values. But maybe you're looking at quantity of short chain fatty acids and you're looking at pancreatic enzyme output. That might give you a much better reference point as to where to start, because we've talked about this many times. Without digestion being strong, a healthy microbiome is just kind of a nice dream or a nice idea. So that's the introduction to the Bifido. That is the story of the most exciting bacterial species of the day, not only because it's the topic. So if we know how we are meant to originally interact with microbes, the next thing I think that's relevant is we need to know how Bifidobacteria are meant to interact and be inside of our guts and microbiome. So they are actually one of the few bacteria that are not potentially pathogenic. I mean, there could be theoretically an overgrowth of Bifido, but Bifidobacteria are really hard to encourage growth of in the gut after the initial stages of life, because you'll come to find out they're actually quite fragile birds. They also have a very particular location, and that is only in the colon based upon the right environment, because they are strict anaerobes. So they don't really inhabit the small intestine. One, because they don't have the ability to modulate the immune system at that level. But number two, because the colon is the principal house of the microbiome in terms of quantity of bacteria in your gut, they kind of underpin an axis of what creates and maintains a healthy microbiome in the colon, because they help to modulate that immune relationship and hopefully outpopulate potential pathogens that can become opportunistic when there's an infection or antibiotic use of any way, shape, or form. So bifidobacteria are really considered, true friendly or good bacteria that do play a very crucial role in preventing dysbiosis. They do some pretty important things for us, so everything we eat, the microbes get exposure to, and all the waste that comes out of our cells, most of it goes through the waste removal process of, condensing itself into fecal matter into the colon. So the food that we can't absorb, the fibers that come through our foods, are still the principal food that we need to understand and remember that if we're not feeding our guts adequate diversity and quantities of food-based fibers, we might actually be starving out these really important bacteria. And why that's important is they help to modulate the immune system and regulate immune responses from a place of inflammation. This is the one that I knew, but I actually forgot, full disclosure, and I was reminded that we make our own B vitamins. Well, we don't, but the bacteria inside our gut, specifically our bifidobacteria in our colon, actually make meaningful quantities of B vitamins that actually translocate across the epithelial barrier, get into the bloodstream, and actually become essential nutrients for metabolic processes in the body. Based upon their ability to A, live in high populations, and B, make different antimicrobial compounds, they do protect us against the potential pathogens that may inhabit us under less than optimal conditions. And why I think Bifido are so powerful, and why products like TruBifido and TruBifidoPRO are so useful for certain populations, is they modulate excessively high levels of inflammation quite well based upon their ability to influence the regulation of the immune system coming back down to a place of homeostasis. And anytime you have inflammation locally in the gut, you have big problems, not only gut-wide, but you can actually have systemic problems as a result of what inflammation in the gut predisposes us to from a microbiome and immune system perspective. Bifidobacter are kind of like the bouncers at the club, if you will. What they do in their influence and their cross-communication with the immune system is they resolve potential issues. They stimulate and modulate specific pathways that induce tolerance and regulation in the immune system, both in the innate Th1 side and the regulatory Th2 side. Via the cytokines they release, they can increase the activity of Th1 activity in the body from an innate immune system perspective to deal with an infection. And then once there is a potential stimulatory aspect of something coming in our system that's pissing off the immune system, they can either create memory in B cells, or they can create increased amounts of secretory IgA immunoglobulins, which trap potential issues in the colon and remove them before they have the ability to translocate across the barrier into the bloodstream. So from a functional perspective, the things that Bifido do most for us is that immune crosstalk, and it's the production of anti-inflammatory cytokines, specifically things like interleukin-10, and the induction of immune tolerance, which is super important at a young age, because that's how we determine the difference between something that's food and nourishing and positive for our bodies and things that are potentially harmful and pro-inflammatory. It's the microbes that help to educate the immune cells based upon telling them what's good and what's bad. The second thing Bifido do for us from a functional perspective is this environmental optimization plan that they have a hand in. So the acidifiers in the gut are the short-chain fatty acids, lactate and acetate, just because of the quantity of those that are produced influences the drop in pH more than any other short-chain fatty acid. But the short-chain fatty acid that is most optimal for maintaining the health of the colonocytes is butyrate. And there's this process called bacterial cross-feeding, which without adequate quantities of bifidobacteria, you can't turn lactate and acetate into butyrate, because they generate the lactate and acetate, which other microbes within a healthy microbiome then convert into butyrate. And what this does is it creates an optimal terrain from an acidity perspective and also an energy perspective. Because if we don't have enough energy and enough acidity, the alkalinity and the drop in energy predisposes the gut barrier to degrading, and it doesn't allow for the goblet cells to make enough mucus to keep that physical protective barrier over top of the epithelial cells. So Bifidobacteria, from a regulatory housekeeping perspective, arguably are some of the most important strains of microbes, or species, I should say, because there are multiple strains within the species of Bifidobacteria. And if we are missing these due to lifestyle and the fact that they are quite fragile, I think you could see how an avenue to the development of immune dysregulation and pro-inflammatory stimuli can exist within the gut. So there's another graphic that kind of outlines the different processes, but their ability to crosstalk with the immune system and drive appropriate immune activities and maintain the health of the gut barrier are something that they can do in a way that other microbes can't do as isolated species. And they're there to kind of, be the anchors of the community. If you think of the idea of a community, there are certain families that may have been there for multiple generations in that community, and they really underpin the culture of that community if it's a healthy one. Because these are the first true colonizers of the gut, this is what Bifidobacteria do within the community of microbes that live in our guts, which we call the microbiome. And I put the link to the study where I got these graphics from. Is really, really interesting read. I highly encourage everyone to read that. So it is really important to understand that for a microbiome to be healthy, it has to be healthy at a community level. And in order for that to be possible, the terrain has to be primed for its survival. If you have clients who, no matter what you do, you try antimicrobial protocols, you try food restrictions, you try intermittent fasting, liquid diets, what have you, and nothing's working, then maybe you're not deep enough in terms of where you're addressing the problem, because dysbiosis can only exist within an environment that's primed for dysbiosis. As Louis Pasteur admitted on his deathbed, I was wrong. It's not the germ, it's the terrain. So when we consider the concept of probiotic supplementation and how to select a probiotic, this is why I always start with Bifidobacteria, because of the important impact they have on the terrain. And a lot of people in the industry will say, oh, well, you can't get them into the gut. You don't know that they're going to survive the trek. And that's not untrue. But I will get into why we've done a little bit of something about that to make our probiotics more efficacious in terms of making sure that they actually get into the part of the small, but specifically large intestine where we want specific strains to go. That's deep delivery. So this is why Bifidobacteria need special consideration when you supplement them. They are, as I said, they are strict anaerobes, and they're gram-positive bacteria. The other reason that being gram-positive is important is when it comes to things like endotoxins, gram-positive bacteria don't have the same endotoxins that gram-negative bacteria do. And a lot of healthy, quote-unquote, microbes are gram-negative. It doesn't mean gram-negative bacteria are problematic. But if someone has an incredibly leaky gut and you are over supplementing them with gram-negative bacteria, that might actually cause a negative stimulatory effect. So that's another reason why Bifido are very gentle for people who are a little bit, canary in the coal mine like scenario within their guts. They're non-motile, so they themselves don't translocate. They also are very slow replicators, and they're incredibly sarcolytic. So without the proper food, they are fiber fermenters. They're carbohydrate dependent strains that are also very antibiotic susceptible, and changes in their terrain can actually wipe out their populations pretty quickly. So when it comes to, addressing dysbiosis and tipping the balance between pathogens and healthy commensals, you want to make sure that you're throwing in the proper microbes, but you also want to bring it back to the understanding of how to support those microbes in their ability to proliferate. So the nurture of those probiotics is typically dependent upon providing them a source of fuel and knowing how to dose them properly with symbiotic and synchronistic products in order for these Bifido to have their best chance of surviving. And that's where we get to part 3, which is Bifidobacteria considerations. Our flagship Bifido product is TruBifidoPRO. And we call this a colon-specific formula based upon our knowledge of how the general distribution of microbes within the human gut is supposed to be. So it contains 5 different strains of Bifidobacteria that have been known to colonize and proven to colonize within the colon, and it's targeted for those who have an overactive immune system. So anything that is pro-inflammatory, from cancers all the way down to potentially IBS and food intolerances, if you don't know where to start within our products of our portfolio rather of probiotic products. That's a fun alliteration. This is where I start, because the goal here is to help repopulate a potentially dysbiotic colon. The quantity of bacteria in the colon is infinitely more diverse and quantitative than that of the small intestine. So even though a lot of the immune cells reside within the small intestine, and SIBO is a problem, colonic dysbiosis can be a lot more complex, and it can be a lot harder to deal with because of the simple quantities of microbes and their ability to create biofilms. So what we're trying to do here is using TruBifidoPRO as a supplement. If someone is colonically dysbiotic, the ability to bind, adhere, and crowd out potential pathogens from a space perspective is one thing they do well. And secondarily, because from a functionality perspective, they downregulate the internal production of pro-inflammatory compounds like histamines and tyramines, and they only produce L-positive lactic acid, which, if you understand the difference between L-positive and D-negative, it'd be like turning your house key upside down and trying to jam it in the lock. It doesn't necessarily work really well, and it can actually damage the lock. So in the case of probiotics that stimulate the production of D-negative lactic acid, if someone has incredible amounts of immune stress, that can evoke a negative reaction. So this is a very anti-inflammatory formula. And from a dosing perspective, we need to make sure that they're in adequate numbers. So 50 billion are guaranteed at expiration, but the likely reality is it's closer to 70 or 75 billion at the time of encapsulation. The thing about TruBifido is the formula in and of itself is fantastic, but you can find these strains in other places. That's cool. It comes back to the conversation of people saying, oh, well, they don't survive the trek within the gut. And that may be true of other products. I don't know, because I haven't seen research on anyone else's products. I know what ours do. And how we've figured this out is knowing the fragility. We layer in contingencies of support to ensure survivability. The first thing is the concept of a delayed release capsule. So a delayed release capsule might survive in the small intestine or maybe through the stomach, not necessarily the small intestine, and it might open prematurely. And as I've said, you do not want to deliver high quantities of bifido to the small intestine because you're putting a square peg in a round hole. So we use sodium alginate, which is, I think of as a life preserver, or a more of a submarine that the little bacteria are taking a dive in. If you can envision something like, a magic school bus where you have a bacteria where he's just got legs and arms and a face, they're going into the submarine and they're being sent on that mission with food to ensure their survival. That's the purpose of lactostim. And it's hard to say, how do you determine dosing that's appropriate for your client? Well, fundamentally, you have to try. I'm always a fan of trying to get the job done with the smallest quantity or the most gentle dose possible. So the amount of capsules you might have to give someone may be based upon their subjective reaction or if it alleviates their symptoms. And then from a frequency, a duration, or a patternistic perspective, if someone is really dysbiotic and they respond positively to, say, 3 capsules of TruBifidoPRO upon the initiation, over time, as you help them find homeostasis within their gut, you can likely drop down not only the quantity that you give them, but potentially the frequency that you give it to them. No one says you have to take a probiotic every day. The assumption is because there's 31 capsules in the bottle and there's 31 days in a month for most months of the year, that you have to do that every day. And if it works for you or your client, I think that's a really, really good thing. But fundamentally, if you are in a good place and you want to take a probiotic for a maintenance purpose, or just because you may be eating some food that is not necessarily optimal for your diet or for your gut, and you want to ensure that you're not going to have a negative reaction, there's nothing to say you can't take a probiotic 1 to 3 times a week. And in terms of duration, I think cyclically is a good thought, because from nature, we got exposure to microbes on a regular basis, but it wasn't our exposure to microbes as an adult that helped build a healthy gut. It was what we put into our bodies and the lifestyle we led. So there are periods of time where you would eat fermented foods and then you wouldn't. I think using that logic when it comes to reason and rationale as to when to take a probiotic has merit, but fundamentally, it's really important to work with the person or work with yourself based upon if something's not feeling good and using this product has helped you feel better, you have made a good decision. And we can get into that with some Q&A at the end. For those who don't know the sodium alginate story, it's not actually purple. This is more for just visual effect. But sodium alginate is the other half of ensuring why these things survive their trek into the colon. And we're using this concept of pH to our advantage because we know that the molecular changes that happen to the sodium alginate under a low pH actually makes it more impenetrable. So it converts from sodium alginate to something called alginic acid, which becomes an impenetrable life raft around the bacteria. And as long as the pH is at a low point, which it is in the stomach and the early part of the small intestine, only once it starts to raise itself to where we want it at the distal end of the small intestine and through the colon, does the alginic acid revert back to sodium alginate. Essentially, it acts then as a prebiotic. It dissolves and it allows the bacteria to be released in the part of the gut that we want them to. And this is a claim that master supplements and US Enzymes can make because the technology is actually proprietary to them as a company. So if someone ever tells you Bifido don't survive, they're not wrong, but they don't know the whole part of the story that makes the contrary true. And then there's the concept of using food to ensure that you can wake them back up. Lactostim is what it is we use. And lactostim is a combination of oleic acid, which you will find in olive oil, and sunflower lecithin, which you will find in supplements that are used for liver health and liver function. These very strongly help to increase the speed of growth of lactic acid producing bacteria. And you might say, well, lactic acid or for lactobacillus. Nope, we talked about this. Bifido are very strong producers of lactate, not just lactobacillus, because it is their job to continuously maintain that low pH with the use of other microbes that are fermenting to keep the pH low enough for two things to happen. For the gut barrier to be strong, three things. For the energy being produced by the gut to be optimal. And the third thing is the colonization and the conversion of certain short-chain fatty acids to butyrate. So we're back to this model, right? We have a baseline inoculation. In the case of supplementation of someone who is not an infant, we're looking at TruBifidoPRO as our baseline of choice for a probiotic to help them potentially alleviate colonic dysbiosis and inflammation. Then we have stimulation of growth, which happens within the product with lactostim, but we also have strategic prebiotics that we can use in conjunction with the baseline inoculation. And there you go. And then there's, the evolution and diversification of what happens within the gut. Well, this is where, you all as clinicians are able to guide your clients to what choices to make to help suit, overall healthy lifestyle. The development of health is maintained by anchoring good sleeping habits, good dietary choices, regular exercise, managing stress, making sure your circadian rhythm is optimized, sleeping well. So what we're trying to do here is replicate the ideal aspects of what nature did when we came into the world, and hopefully the replication of that can help us find homeostasis again within our guts. Because strategic prebiotic supplementation is really worth talking about because there are a lot of different supplemental fibers available on the market. And most prebiotics are designed to feed the healthy or good bacteria, but a lot of the fibers out there like chicory root and inulin also have the ability to feed known pathogens, or if we oversupplement, we can have commensal organisms become overly populated, and as a result of their overgrowth, they become part of the dysbiosis. And how we can structure this in terms of what products to choose, we have 3 different forms of strategic fiber that are all based upon sun fiber at the core. And in the case of sun spectrum, we even include Bifidobacterium in there, the Lactis, which is the one that is one of the most powerful influencers of the production of short-chain fatty acids and also the early colonizers. So what we're doing is we're feeding the partially hydrogenated guar gum or hydrolyzed guar gum, and our target is Bifidobacteria. What they do in terms of interacting is they're going, yes, this is the food we want, we're going to make lactate. So that lactate is taken up by other strains that work in this cross-feeding relationship with Bifido, and they convert that lactate to butyrate. Butyrate then becomes a multitude of things. A preferred energy source for the colonocytes. It helps to build the really important strains known as Akkermansia and Akkermansia muciniphila. And their role is to break down the mucus layer to stimulate the regeneration or the renewal of the mucus layer. But butyrate concentrations in the gut are highly correlated with healthy metabolism in the host. So the ecosystem concept really comes back full fold. And it's not just TruBifido and Sun Spectrum that you can find different strains of Bifidobacterium. Even looking at Immunozyme, which is, in my opinion, a multivitamin for your immune system, the goal of this product is to introduce regulation within your T cells. So the activity of the T regulatory cells are boosted up. So Bifidobacterium in 2 different strains, from a research perspective, are known to help introduce the concept of T regulatory cell activity when we may have an excessively high Th1, Th2, or Th17 response, often seen in autoimmune patients. So that was a ton of information. I hope a lot of that hit home, but I think the most important thing to end on is, this is Mother Nature, and I have to thank Mr. Thurston for this wonderful graphic. I don't think Mother Nature makes very many mistakes, and if she does, what mistakes she makes aren't fit for survival in this world. So as practitioners, if we can understand the patterns of the body, if we can understand the concept of how a symbiosis takes hold, not only from a model of the microbiome and the human host, but within the activities of the microbiome, because the body is all about optimizing its ability to make energy and maintain maximal adaptability, so illness isn't a thing. And as long as we live in her realm, we will not be able to improve upon the pattern she sets forth. And I think the wise clinician realizes this and starts to figure out how to work with the body, because the body will always tell you what it needs through the concept of reading labs appropriately and knowing how to work with symptoms and symptomatology to select the right products. It's about a process. It's not about a product, but ultimately, if we stick to that process and we work with a patient, we can really move mountains for those people. So I want to thank you all for your time. I want to thank you all for being here today. And I wish you a good rest of the day.